Hello and welcome to this presentation and panel discussion on peace education in formal schools. Today we will be discussing how to promote a culture of peace through peace education, what that looks like in practice, and some of the challenges, dilemmas, and opportunities that come along with trying to mainstream peace education into formal school systems around the world. This includes in contexts of relative peace and in context with recent or ongoing experience of violent conflict. My name is Caroline Brooks, and I am the Syria Program Manager at International Alert. I am also the co-author of the report, Peace Education in Formal Schools, Why is it important and how can it be done? This report forms the basis of our discussion today. It is my great pleasure to be chairing today's event. Thank you all for joining us for what promises to be a really interesting and hopefully lively discussion. I would like to thank our event co-hosts, the British Council and the Cambridge Peace and Education Research Group. I would also like to thank our panelists, not only for joining us today, but also because all of them have contributed their expertise and their insights to the report as interviewees and or as reviewers, and they have all greatly enriched the final product. We will get to hear more about our panelists' work and backgrounds in the field of peace education during the course of today's event. But by way of brief introductions, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. First, we have Basma Hajir. Basma is a doctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge and my fellow author on this peace education report. We also have Dr. Hilary Kremin, reader at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Kevin Kester, Assistant Professor of Comparative International Education and Peace and Development Studies at Seoul National University. Maria Nomiku, Youth Skills and Inclusive Community Sector Lead for Europe at the British Council. Nomisha Kurian, Doctoral Researcher at the University of Cambridge. We have Dr. Phil Gittins, Education Director at World Beyond War. Rhiannon Webb, who's a Senior Teacher at the British Council. And Dr. Tony Jenkins, Managing Director of the International Institute on Peace Education and the coordinator of the Global Campaign for Peace Education. Thank you all so much for joining us. So for today's event, I will start by introducing the report to you to give us a bit of background and to set the framework for our discussion. I will then hand over to Basma, who will then take a few minutes to situate our report in the field of peace education, giving us some conceptual clarity and outlining some of the debates about mainstreaming peace education in formal schools. We will then briefly summarize the main findings and recommendations from the report before turning to our panelists for a structured question and answer session in which we will explore some of the critical issues raised in the report. We will then have some time for questions from the audience. So as audience members, you can ask your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Please remember to leave details about yourself and who in the panel you are directing your question to. Feel free to post questions at any time during the event, and we will try to get through as many as possible in the latter stages of the event. We are recording the event so that we can share it online afterwards and for those who cannot make it today. You are also welcome to tweet about the event, and the hashtags will be posted in the chat function, also to be found at the bottom of your screen.
¿Tú puedes apagar tu volumen?
No, no me estés echando la culpa, Philip.
No puedes apagar el volumen porque quiero escuchar aquí.
Just one second. Okay. Okay, so to kick us off and to set the scene, I'd like to take a few minutes to give you some background to the report and to set the framework for our discussion. So the research for the report was inspired by the results of a peace perceptions poll, which was carried out in 2018 by International Alert in collaboration with the British Council and RIWI. The primary goal of the poll was to answer questions around how people experience and respond to violent conflict and how they think their government should respond to conflict. Through the Peace Perceptions poll, more than 100,000 people in 15 countries, from those in active conflict to those in relative peace, were asked about their views on peace and conflict. A significant percentage of respondents to the survey perceived that governments needed to invest in peace education to achieve sustainable peace. More specifically, there was an almost universal support for teaching peace, tolerance, and conflict resolution in schools. We thought this was a really interesting finding that deserved more exploration, and we decided to do a follow-up piece of research to unpack what teaching peace in school means, what the potential impact of peace education can be, and how it might be achieved in practice. So at this point, and before going through the main findings and recommendations for the report, I'd like to hand over to Basma, who will give us an overview of peace education from a conceptual point of view and highlight how this report contributes to the field of peace education. Basma, over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today, and thank you to all the panelists for their great contribution to the report. Like Caroline said, I'll briefly provide an overview of peace education, just so we somehow situate the report theoretically and also clarify its scope. And I'll then hand over back to Caroline to take us through the findings. So what is peace education? Peace education is a subfield of study that constitute one part of the wider field of peace and conflict studies. Peace education is intrinsically transdisciplinary, so this means that various disciplines have contributed to its development. And it is part of the larger process of education for peace building. So sometimes some people use the two expressions interchangeably, but I think in actuality, they're distinct. And I would like to briefly start by clarifying the difference between peace education and education for peace building, because I think this is really important to define the scope of our report. First off, one primary difference between education for peace building and peace education is the level at which the work focuses on. So education for peace building focuses on the sector level. So interventions and reforms, for example, target governance structures, resource allocation, curricular revisions, language policies, and others. And the main purpose is to address inequalities in education that are likely to perpetuate social injustices or trigger violent conflicts. So education for peace building explores how the education system and the peace building process intersect and under what conditions they can support each other. Peace education, on the other hand, targets more the individual level. So recipients of peace education efforts are usually students, children, youth, teachers, and the primary aim is to increase their awareness of obstacles of peace and to provide them with needed knowledge and skills to resolve conflict non-violently. Now, this doesn't mean that peace education is oblivious to structures of violence. It's not at all the case, because peace education maintains a faith in the potential of education to empower students to identify and challenge power dynamics and structures that shape different aspects of their reality. So we have critical peace education scholars, for example, who draw on critical pedagogies and also use some analytical concepts like positive peace and negative peace to underscore and accentuate that we as peace scholars or peace education scholars do not value stability over social change, and that we are as invested in dismantling structures of violence, oppression, and injustice as much as we're invested in promoting peace values and skills on the individual levels. And one of the most important voices in the field of critical peace education is Professor Manisha Bajaj. She's a professor of international and multicultural education at the University of San Francisco. It's so unfortunate that she's not with us today, but I'd like to thank her because she also contributed to the report with her insights. Now, a very brief overview of empirical approaches to peace education. We notice that they're so diverse. For example, in conflict context, we note that there is a tendency sometimes to focus on the potential contribution of education towards reconciliation. So we read a lot on contested narratives, history teaching, intergroup contact, integrated education, or mixing, for example. In other contexts, we see other forms of peace education. So we hear about development education, environment education, conflict resolution, or social justice education. And of course, there is overlap. So some of these forms of education or peace education could be also sometimes delivered in conflict-affected context. Now, with regard to formal schools, which is the focus of our report, there is kind of a lack of research that explores the application of peace education in formal schools. But broadly speaking, if we explore this literature in this specific area, one important tension arises. And it is about whether we should mainstream peace education in formal schools or not. So on one hand, there is a group of scholars who express an outright rejection of mainstreaming peace education. Some of them even use the argument, the kiss of death argument, which entails that the very values, aims, and concerns of peace education will be undermined or canceled out if we integrate them within school structures that are seen as repressive for several reasons. Like, for example, schools are obsessed with outcomes, with evaluation, punitive modes of discipline, or sometimes the form of education, vertical teacher-student relationships. But there is another group of scholars who believe that an outright rejection of delivering peace education in formal schools is kind of overworked or misguided. Through our report, we clearly align ourselves with this second stance for clear reasons. And most importantly, because we believe that, yes, we can choose to adopt this deconstructive stance and kind of engage in extreme structured blaming. And in the process, we give up on settings attended by the vast majority of our children and youth, settings where students spend a great amount of their time, and settings that eventually shape the values and the norms and the attitudes of our children. Or we move away from extreme structure blaming towards addressing the individual responsibility that lies behind these repressive school structures. Now, if you go back to the arguments that reject peace education in formal schools, we find that they conceive of peace education as an intervention, as a program, or a curriculum, or a content. And because the values of this curriculum or this specific content is kind of in stark contrast with the school structures, then we should restrict these programs to the non-formal sector. Our position in this report differs in that we don't see peace education as a program or a curriculum. We instead offer a reconceptualizing of peace education in formal schools in a way that we make addressing the repressive school structures as an essential component of what peace education aims to do in these settings. And by doing so, this report starts to fill out an important gap related to the current lack of conceptual clarity around what is peace education in formal schools. And you know, Caroline, in 2003, Ben Poreth, a peace education scholar, wrote that the multiplicity of answers to the questions of what is peace education is, and I'm quoting here, the most severely undermining factor of peace education as a scholarly and pedagogic field. I believe that today, almost 18 years later, this argument is actually still relevant, particularly in relation to formal schools. And this is essentially the gap that this report attempts to contribute to filling out. As if you had a look at the report, you'll see that we start by proposing a broad overarching conceptualization of what is peace education in formal schools. And we believe that the importance of this lies in enabling us to unpack the multifaceted process and the different dimensions that we need to focus on if we are to exert serious efforts towards operationalizing it, of course, with sensitivities to different contexts. I think I'll stop here, Caroline, and back to you to take us through the findings of the report.
Thank you very much, Basma. That's great. Just a note to all of our panelists as well. We've got lots of people from many corners of the globe joining us today. So when we're going through, we just speak as slowly as possible, as loudly as possible into microphone, so everyone can hear us who's joining us. So that would be great. So onwards to have a look at the findings of our report. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, which will just highlight the kind of the main findings and the recommendations from the report. So just bear with me 1 second and I shall do that now. Great. Okay, so the main findings of our report. So advancing peace education within formal school contexts, we requires a multifaceted approach and process. There is no one size fits all solution, but there are some key principles and approaches that are necessary. First of all, we saw that promoting healthy relationships and a peaceful school culture overall is really important. Secondly, is to address the structural and cultural violence within schools. Thirdly, is to take account of the way that education is delivered in the classroom. Fourth is to connect peace education approaches that focus on the individual with wider socio-political outcomes. Third is to connect peace education within schools to wider community practices and non-formal actors, such as non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. And where possible, have education policies and legislation that support peace education to achieve full integration into formal school settings. And to focus on the key recommendations from our report, we have come up with 6, which will be really interesting to unpack and discuss with you all. So first is that school leaders should establish and promote a school ethos that aligns with the main values and principles of peace and examines and addresses the structural and cultural factors that sustain violence in schools. Second is that peace education approaches should aim to go beyond curriculum development and work on internalizing particular skills, competencies, values, and practices both within the classroom and beyond it. Third, that peace education initiatives in formal schools must be accompanied by training for teachers and the school leadership, and that such efforts should be based on and informed by an understanding of the institutional and environmental barriers to integrating peace education in the specific context. Fourthly, that the form of education inside the classroom should combine individual approaches to peace education with approaches that focus on socio-political outcomes and help students realize their own contribution to conflict dynamics in wider society. Fifthly, that efforts to advance peace education should be situated within the broader structure of the policy and legislative environment where it is appropriate to do so, linking local non-formal efforts to more formal structures and processes should also be explored. And finally, that global coordination and collaboration between practitioners and policymakers is needed to increase learning and exchange, advance both theory and practice, and link individual initiatives to wider and more systemic global initiatives, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And so in summary, and we bring it all together as in this diagram, we see the multifaceted and holistic approach that we are recommending in the report. So We will now turn to our panelists and invite them to explore some of the critical questions and debates that were raised in the report from both practical and theoretical perspectives. I'd like to come first to Dr. Hilary Kremen. Dr. Hilary Kremen researches conflict transformation and peace building in and through education in settings in the UK and elsewhere, and has extensive experience in designing, implementing, and evaluating peace education programs in the UK. She has worked in public and private and voluntary sector as a school teacher, educational consultant, project coordinator, and academic. Hilary, your question. Drawing on your experience in both theory and practice of peace education, can you please reflect on the importance of moving away from understanding of peace education as a curriculum towards understanding it as a multifaceted approach and process? What are the main challenges to integrating peace education in formal schools that we need to keep in mind?
Thank you, Caroline. I'd like to start by thanking those of you for whom English is not your first language for your patience in listening and engaging with what we're talking about today. And I'd also like to thank the panelists for whom English isn't their first language for their fluency and their ways of communicating with us. I recognise it often goes unnoticed, actually. I take it for granted. But so many of our colleagues are working in 2 or 3 different languages all the time. And I am deeply grateful for the people who have spent time learning different languages so that they can communicate with us today. I think that's one element that I would like to highlight when I bring up a concept of structural and cultural violence, because it seems to me that when we think about schools and peace education, they're not neutral places. And so young people learn as much from what we do as from what we say. So that the ways that we organise schools, what we sometimes refer to as the hidden curriculum, is just as important as the curriculum itself and what we're teaching young people. Those of you who are parents will know that your children often respond to what you're doing rather than what you're telling them to do. And we bring about change and growth and love and peace by modelling those things in the way that we rear our children in our families. The same goes for schools. We need to have school environments in which children learn from absorbing what compassion and care and curiosity and growth actually look like. And in order for us to do that, we need to take account of the inadvertent ways in which structural and cultural violence might operate through systems of schooling in ways that we may perhaps not be fully conscious of. So in my work, I've drawn on Johan Galtung and his theory of positive and negative peace. And Johan Galtung, who was the first professor of peace studies, spoke about defining peace through thinking about different kinds of violence. So he talked about direct, structural and cultural violence. And I think it's really useful for us to use those concepts when we think about schools. So what are the ways in which schools sometimes enable direct violence? So sadly, in different parts of the world, we still have corporal punishment, so children are still beaten. We have problems where young people are forced to do engage in particular ways of being educated, perhaps rote learning, or are given very little choice about what we do. We also have systemic structural violence in schools. We often talk about how education is a great leveller. It's about inclusion, it's about social mobility. If we look at the outcomes of education, both within national jurisdictions, but also globally, what we see is that education is often used as a sorting device. It operates in order to give validity to powerful knowledge of powerful groups within society, and to exclude those who don't have access to these kinds of powerful knowledge. Therefore, if peace education is simply a curriculum telling people to be nice to each other, but in the meantime we have young people being made to feel inadequate, or not having their needs met, or underachieving, or noticing others from similar social groups to them underachieving, then we end up giving messages to young people that conflict and violence are the norm within our social settings. And that's what I mean by cultural violence, which can be systemic within systems of education, where we become blind to these things. The great myth of meritocracy here is particularly significant. This idea that anybody from any background can do well in education. And of course some do, but the vast majority don't. And so we need to think about social justice within our schools, within our education system. We need to think about the ways that we organise schools. I can give an example of a school in Leeds, for example, where they start every Monday, Wednesday and Friday morning with a circle, where everybody gets to talk about their weekend or about their week, adults and children, and they all check in. They set their goals and they review their goals together as a community. They create an atmosphere of family. That's a particular way of organising schools, which enables peace education to be embodied throughout the whole school process. So I would say that if we want to work towards positive peace in schools, we need to work with young people in order to tackle structural and cultural violence. We're never going to eradicate it, either within our schools or within outside society, and we should certainly not stop trying to do that. But unless we take these things seriously, then we're not going to be able to work towards genuine peace. I think the final point that I would make is that those of us involved in the field of peace education have this constant tension between utopia and realism. So on the one hand, we'll have dreams of what we think peace education should be. And then on the other hand, we have the ground beneath our feet and the reality of schools. And some people would say we shouldn't be doing peace education because we're setting up false expectations, and schools are not just places anyway. But I certainly wouldn't hold that point of view. I think we work towards a better world. We work towards a peaceful world, but we always notice the ground beneath our feet. We look at starting points. We have an awful lot of people involved in peace education as consultants or project leaders who promise the earth, and some of them are very well paid, and they go from school to school. And we don't actually see any sustainable change because nobody's taken account of the conditions in which these programs are being introduced. So we start by treating colleagues as collaborators. We work together. We take a good, honest look at what is happening in school. And we create curriculum and policy and practice that create a culture of peace rather than a culture of violence, competition and war. And we do so with humility, through collaboration and through compassion and care to all of our young people.
Thank you very much, Hilary. some great insights there from your work and your experience, and some really strong messages, I think, for us to bear in mind and to hopefully get to discuss further as we go forward in the discussion. So thank you very much, Hilary, for getting us off to a great start there. I'd like to welcome Dr. Kevin Kester next. Kevin is the Assistant Professor of Comparative International Education and Peace and Development Studies at Seoul National University. Kevin researches the intersections of education, conflict, and peace building in local and global contexts, and the role of international organizations in attempting to foster peace through education. Kevin is particularly interested in critical theoretical perspectives on research and practice in peace and education that could contribute to new pedagogies and policies for social change. Welcome, Kevin. Our report argues for the importance of connecting peace education approaches that are focused on the individual to wider socio-political outcomes, and the importance of addressing structural causes for conflict. So how do we go about reconciling theory and practice in the field? How can we indeed work for both individual psychosocial and also socio-political approaches in formal schools that are in reality fraught with different forms of structural and cultural violence, as Hilary has just highlighted for us?
Yes, thank you, Caroline, for this very excellent question. And I want to start by responding to some of the points that Hilary made as well, and particularly pointing out the importance of linguistic diversity and being sensitive to the linguistic backgrounds of our students. I do agree with Hilary that this is often overlooked, as well as this artificial dichotomy between idealism and realism. And I bring this up because I think it's the same artificial dichotomy between theory and practice, or psychosocial and sociocultural, socio-political approaches. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to challenge these dualisms that perpetuate a lot of our work. But the first thing I would say is that I think we must acknowledge that theory is important, that insights are not arrived at simply through doing or through practice, but instead through reflection on our practices. It's through reflection on our practices, for example, that we come to realize that the structural violence of a biased curriculum and the cultural violence of white supremacy that puts it there runs deep. The structural violence of punitive justice in schools and the cultural violence of militarism, power over, or realpolitik that puts it there, runs deep. So for me, such reflection is theorizing. It's the starting point of action and theory for positive social change. Just as participatory democracy is dependent upon a well-informed public, so too is peace work dependent on a deep and systematic reflection. Such reflection informs our future practices, just as our previous practices have informed the theorizing. And do note that I'm using the present continuous ing here purposefully to suggest that social theory is never done, it's never fixed, it's never static, and it is not all-knowing. I think many of those in the audience might understand this as I do. Essentially, it's what I understand Paulo Freire to mean when he talks about praxis, theory-informed action and practice-informed theory. So how do we reconcile theory and practice? Through reflexivity. But let me caution here that I'm not talking about first-order reflexivity that is prescribed in much of the literature, and which I also understand Freire to be speaking of. This focuses on the responsibility of teachers and students. Although that type of first-order reflexivity is important, it nevertheless, for me, falls short. It risks blaming the individuals for the faults of the system. What we need is collective reflexivity or second-order reflexivity to reconcile theory and practice. The peace scholar Anatol Rappaport in 1960, this is 60 years ago, claims, open quote, "The critical issue of peace and the need to convert conflict to cooperation demand incorporation of second-order learning in social systems. And the most effective way to produce social learning is through a participative design process," close quote. But he cautioned that change at the system level is more challenging than the individual level, where individuals can adjust their worldview according to personal experiences. Systems do have underlying assumptions, but they are more resistant to change than individual members. So let me explain further. The first order of reflexivity is our own personal practices, our theories, our assumptions as teachers, citizens, students. The second order is the collective practices, theories, and assumptions of our professional fields. The two are, of course, entangled. But the second order raises the sociological imaginary that can connect our individual practices to those of the field and offer the potential for systemic change as well as personal change. So let us consider violence, which Hillary was speaking of. If violence is manifest at the micro level, then a micro response and first order reflexivity may very well be sufficient. Yet if that violence is at the macro level, then certainly macro, as well as micro responses, will be required to address the systemic factors contributing to the violence. And of course, the levels of violence are not always clear. They're not clear-cut. Put another way, domestic violence and bullying are not personal matters. They are reified through cultural and structural institutions. But this much has been known for 50 years. Galtung has been writing about this for ages. What is not widely acknowledged, though, is the post-structural aspect of this. That is the role of you and I, the role of the peace agents. We're taken as benevolent, and the gaze of science is really directed toward us. So let me explain with one example that comes out of the International Alert Report of why this is important and how it reconciles the duality of theory and practice. If a peace educator approaches peace as only behavioral, that is, the problem lies in the individual student's behaviors, then the socio-political factors influencing that behavior are ignored, much to the detriment of peace building, even while the psychosocial may have been adequately addressed. A school-based example here is blaming gun violence in schools on the perpetrators alone. Not that they should not be held accountable. Of course they must. But if the accountability stops there, and it stops with bringing trauma counselors in to console students, then we are doomed to repeat because the broader culture and structure of violence that supports this has not been addressed. Moreover, the role of ourselves in this as educators, as mediators, and the implicit theories that drive our work are not critiqued. So my question to you is, what is the theory of change that drives your work? We all have one. Vanessa Andreotti refers to this as up the river work, meaning we need to get to the root causes of the problems and the cavities in our theories and our practices. I think I've made my point. Theory and practice are inseparable. But let me just summarize this before I conclude. My point is we all have theories informing our work, whether we acknowledge those theories or not. Practitioners have theories of social change at hand. They are operating with particular assumptions about how to create positive social change. Teachers do the same when they adopt particular pedagogies, and researchers the same when we use particular methodologies. So what we call theorizing or theory then is, at least for me, it's really reflection. And reflection is part of the human condition, and it's a part of our work as educators. Children do it naturally when they learn to grow. What peace education needs now then is more reflection, more theory, not less, particularly at the level of the underlying assumptions that drive our field. And second order reflexivity can help us to work collectively in this direction. The International Alert Report is a step in that direction, drawing from the reflective experiences of several peace educators practicing in diverse contexts. And with all reflection, it brings with it critique as well as hope. Now, I realize I haven't said much here about the psychosocial. But given that I'm speaking from the Korean context, let me share with you very quickly one example of my interpretation of an aspect of Korean culture that I think illustrates my point, or my thinking on this particular area. The word for the mind in Korean is maum. Maum also translates as heart. And my colleagues and my teachers, when discussing their thinking, they hold their hands on their chest. Each time this happens, and it happens a lot, it reminds me of how intimately our affections drive our thinking and action. So like theory and practice, the psychosocial is inseparable from the socio-political. We can learn a lot from each other's theories and practices, the cynical, the critical, the optimistic. And with that, I'll stop with this response. Thank you very much, Caroline, for an excellent question.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I would just like to encourage our audience members to leave questions in the Q&A box as we go forward, I'm sure, and I can see them popping up every now and again. That's stimulating a lot of questions and thought. So thank you so much for your extremely thoughtful and clear points there, Kevin. I'm now going to turn to Nomisha Kurian, who is a doctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge. Nomisha researches child well-being in high poverty schools in India. And previously she undertook a human rights research fellowship at Yale University. Her work is unified by the theme of building safe, inclusive, and peaceful schools. Nomisha, thanks very much for being here and being part of our panel. Having conducted your research and fieldwork in formal schools that are trying to implement peace education in India, can you tell us about the types of barriers and challenges that could be unique to contexts of the Global South? What insights or recommendations can you share with practitioners who are working towards developing a culture of peace in school environments in contexts with high rates of poverty and adversity?
Thank you, Caroline. First off, really excited to be here. It's lovely to see so many people with us and the sheer buzz of ideas and questions in the chat. I really enjoyed reading the International Alert Report because it's helped me reflect on my research in India. I have 4 points that I would like to make about peace education in the Global South. The teachers that I have worked with in India have had a vision of peace education that's meant a kind of everyday relational peace, which for them meant building school cultures of care and well-being. In the process, though, they had to regularly confront macro-level issues of violence at the societal level. So in terms of barriers and ways forward, my first point would be that teachers need to be surrounded by an ocean of support from multiple sectors beyond education. This is because when peace education is implemented in settings of adversity, teachers may not always have the material, social, and political resources to stop violence when they find out it's happening. For example, when one teacher in my research found out that a child was being forced into child labor and being beaten by her employers, this teacher had no one to call for support. In her area, there simply weren't police officers or social workers or any multi-agency system of child safeguarding for her to lean on. So I really appreciate how the International Alert Report makes a strong point about collaborations and partnerships. I think this would be very helpful for teachers in these kind of challenging contexts where they need that ocean of support to let them know that they're not alone, and also to give them that kind of structured framework to effectively implement peace education. My second point is that teacher well-being matters. Teacher well-being always matters, but I think in peace education in particular, we need to talk about this more. because when we look at the literature, I think we have a very natural tendency to focus on young people or students as the beneficiaries. And there isn't always that much literature looking at the everyday struggles and the emotional turmoil that the teachers themselves can face, especially in non-Western contexts. That's why I centered this piece of research in India around looking at the everyday moments of tension or frustration or just plain puzzlement and uncertainty that these teachers faced. I think it's good to note that in under-resourced settings of adversity and poverty, teachers who deliver peace education programs are probably going to be undertaking a huge amount of emotional labor that isn't always seen or noticed or formally recognized. And this can take its own mental toll on the teacher concerned. In the example I just spoke about before, with the child who was at risk of being a child labor victim, she was reaching out to a teacher who herself became very distressed by her struggle to help the child in challenging situations. So perhaps we need to ask ourselves, when we design a peace education program, how are we going to protect our teachers from burnout? How are we going to protect them from secondary trauma as they carry this out? How are we going to ensure that teachers themselves have safe spaces to talk through their feelings or their thoughts or their dilemmas? So I think this is the principle of how the caregivers need care themselves. My third point is around a culture of healing. This is a phrase that the International Alert Report uses, and I think that's a lovely concept, a culture of healing. In my research in India, when I asked a child about corporal punishment, which was a long-standing problem in the schools that he had been to, this child made a statement that really shocked me and that was on my mind for a long time afterwards. He said that he doesn't think teacher kindness is important. He said, I think we as children need to get scared because our job is just to pass exams and to get good grades. So we need to be beaten to stay motivated to study. I think that to start promoting a culture of healing, perhaps it begins with understanding that the young people we want to help may well have internalized norms of violence being acceptable or even desirable, in which case we need a critical understanding of all the social and political and historical factors that led to those norms in the first place. My final point is about taking an assets-based approach. I know I've mentioned the severe, direct, and structural and cultural violence that my participants encountered, but I want to point out that I also witnessed a lot of creativity and innovation in this cultural context. I think that when we speak of developing countries and high poverty settings in general, there may be a tendency to dwell on these contexts in terms of what they lack, but it's so important not to go in with a deficit lens. I think part of being optimistic about peace education is taking an asset-centered approach where we look for the strengths and capabilities already existing in the local community. We might ask, what kind of local activism already exists here before we came in? What wisdom might local voices offer us? What grassroots movements for peace already exist that we can recognize and honor and build on? So to sum up, in terms of working in settings of poverty and adversity in the global south, the key points that I have been reflecting on are, for one, surrounding teachers with an ocean of support, lots of multi-sectoral partnerships beyond education, taking care of the caregiver, remembering teachers' well-being and making sure that they feel safe and supported too, along with the children and the young people. Also promoting cultures of healing and understanding the complex social and political conditions that lead to violence being seen as normal or desirable. And finally, taking an assets-based approach, thinking about how to amplify local voices and how to recognize and honor all the local activism, creativity, and innovation that already exists in the context. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks so much to you, Nomisha, for summing up your thoughts there so eloquently. I think an ocean of support is a lovely phrase, and I will definitely be stealing that from you. So, and I think the last point you made about an assets-based approach as well ties in quite nicely with what Hilary was mentioning in her remarks as well, about what is the ground beneath. Like, start with the ground beneath you, start with where you are as well, and that kind of realistic approach as well to building on what is there. So thanks very much again, Nomisha. We'll look forward to hearing more from you as well in the Q&A session. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Tony Jenkins, who is the Managing Director of the International Institute on Peace Education and the coordinator of the Global Campaign for Peace Education. Tony has over 20 years of experience directing and designing peace building and international educational programs and projects, and leadership in the international development of peace studies and peace education. Tony is currently a lecturer in the program on justice and peace studies at Georgetown University. Since 2001, he has served as the Managing Director of the International Institute on Peace Education, and since 2007 as the coordinator of the Global Campaign for Peace Education. Tony's research is focused on examining the impacts and effectiveness of peace education methods and pedagogies in nurturing personal, social, and political change and transformation. He is also interested in formal and non-formal educational design and development, with special interest in teacher training, alternative approaches to global security, systems design, disarmament, and gender. Tony, welcome, and thanks very much for being with us today. In our report, we mentioned the importance of connecting peace education with education policies and legislation. Can you please elaborate on the significance of this particular element? What opportunities might there be to do this, and what challenges might arise when we try to integrate peace education into existing policy?
Well, thank you for the wonderful question and the very generous introduction. And I also want to thank you, Caroline and Basma, for not just authoring this report, but bringing us together. You know, we all contributed through various interviews to what you've generated, but this is the first chance we've had to have a truly global international exchange with our colleagues. And my head's already spinning with the questions that have been generated from the speakers that have preceded me. And I have a lot of kind of critical reflection that I know I'll be engaging in as I go forward today. So I think I need to begin my response with some more broad and general reflections on educational policy that I think need to be at the center of this conversation. One of the things that you pulled from my interview in the report was this idea that formal schools not only provide knowledge and skills, but they also shape social and cultural values, norms, attitudes, and dispositions. And this is really important to grasp for a number of reasons. First, as Hilary pointed out a few minutes ago, we need to have an awareness of the influence that educational policy and our pedagogical practices can have on shaping the attitudes towards conflict, violence, and so forth that our students develop. And I think we also need to have this awareness that formal schooling is perhaps one of the most influential sites of cultural production and reproduction. And educational policy that shapes schooling, we also have to have this awareness, is often established from a worldview of obviously a very relative few social and political elites who quite often seek to maintain their power and privilege through the maintenance of the status quo. So from the lens of critical peace education, as Basma was talking about, this policy influence itself can be considered a form of structural violence that by design establishes and maintains an inequitable distribution of power in society. So if we recognize this, it becomes somewhat obvious and strategically and prudent that we're going to want to influence educational policy more in the direction that aligns with the values of peace education. But as others have already pointed out, this is not a terribly easy task, especially when we bring in a lens of critical peace education, which again, at its heart, invites critical challenges to social structures of which formal education is a major and institutionalized actor, right? I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of what's been happening and unfolding in the United States over the past 9 or 10 months. And one of the most contested spheres of educational policy and practice that we are experiencing is related to the teaching of the Black Lives Matter movement, police brutality, structural racism, the rise of white nationalism, and so forth. And I believe that educators' efforts to integrate these concerns into the curricula, which, by the way, has been done mostly non-formally through teachers' own initiatives, not through policy. But this has had a profound effect, and we can see this, on challenging cultural assumptions, and has contributed significantly to what we see as this widespread participation of younger generations in the current social political movements. But it has also at the same time, produced a very anticipated political backlash. For example, former President Trump, it's nice to say that former part in there, right? On his way out of office, he established this insidious 1776 commission as a rebuke largely to these teachings. And I don't know, I guess I'll encourage you to look at the report. I think it's important to see. Thankfully, though, this commission has already been repealed by President Biden. But the political discord it inflamed through its rhetoric is not going to go away anytime soon. So we can observe here the ways in which policy is often dictated and shaped by the political winds. So even if well-intentioned educational policy is able to be established, it can often be abused and interpreted to meet the agendas of the political agents who are in control. So given this critical analysis, as Bosma pointed out, some researchers are, I would say, less than optimistic that formal peace education can have any kind of significant impact in addressing the structural conditions of society. And what they're suggesting is basically a Sisyphean task to change the culture from within an institution that was designed to maintain that culture. I fall into the latter camp that Bosma and Caroline pointed out. I have a little bit more hope. I find that these critiques are actually quite helpful. They help to illuminate for us this systemic relationship between school and society and point us in a direction that is maybe a bit more of a holistic and strategic path for how we can implement change. And this is maybe where I finally get to answering your question on the significance of also fostering collaborative partnerships between formal and non-formal sectors in pursuing policy. So this is basically what I've observed over a number of years now. When educational policy that aligns with peace education emerges at the top level, it has always been the result of the influence coming from the grassroots, right? So communities and NGOs, they're sort of our educational first responders. They're quick and adept at responding to social injustices through non-formal educational interventions. And they're also working at that level of society in which the experience and manifestations of structural violence are most intimately felt and experienced. Whereas for those at the upper level of the policy, they're still a bit of an abstraction. So when these non-formal educational efforts are sustained over time, we get this groundswell of cultural change that starts to emerge from below and flows up into the middle ranges. If we think of John Paul Lederach's 3 tiers of peace building in that structure. And then it's generally at this stage where we start to see elected officials begin to get on board, right? So they start to recognize that the societal structural conditions are already beginning to change around them. Of course, I don't want to dissuade people who want to approach the policy change from the top. Structural changes can come from that direction. And I think we need a strategy that works from both the top down and the bottom up and the middle out. But when we start from the top, it's obviously very slow. But nonetheless, even poorly implemented policy can create precedent that grassroots can harness. So I think it's important to have these political and strategical realities in mind. But I also maybe want to take a turn here and suggest that we need to also think pedagogically when we think about policy. We should seek to apply our understanding of how change happens with learners in our classrooms and find ways to adapt it to the political context. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about how we shape policy. And when I talk about partnership between the formal and the non-formal, I'm describing a very particular type of relationship. Partners dialogue with each other. They listen. They attempt to understand each other's interests and their concerns. This is an orientation that we take in our pedagogical practice, and we can do much better to apply this to traditional political contexts. Obviously, traditional political modes too often create adversaries, not partners. And even though we're trained in these pedagogical practices, when we move into the political spheres, we adapt to those old political norms. I see that happen all the time with educators. So I'd like to maybe wrap this up by sharing a story of this idea in action, this principle applied. Years ago, I was visiting with a coalition of peace education partners in Colombia, and they had arranged a meeting with the Ministry of Education officials to discuss the possibilities of further integrating peace education into existing educational policy. So of course, this by its nature, it was a political encounter. There was a political goal in mind, a change that we sought to create. But the encounter was approached much more pedagogically. So led by my colleagues from Fundación Escuelas de Paz, officials were invited first to experience the practices that the educators had been using in the schools. If you can imagine, they sat in colored mandalas together. It's sort of a way of centering and connecting. They did a blind trust walk. Can you imagine that? Walking with these education officials, having them blindfolded, having them trust you. And they did all these other activities as well, all before getting to the conversation at hand. And I think few can really imagine planning a meeting with a political agenda this way. But maybe by trusting our pedagogical principles, as our colleagues in Colombia did, we might come to more promising political results. So that's what I thought I would share with you today. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tony. And I'm looking forward to having some more questions and kind of delving into some of those examples, which are really fascinating and interesting. And thanks again for your contribution to today and also to the report. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Phil Gittins, who is the Education Director at Worlds Beyond War. Phil is a practitioner scholar with over 20 years leadership, programming and analysis experience in the areas of peace, education, and youth and community development. His areas of expertise include peace education, conflict transformation, youth, peace and security, and participatory action research. He is active in delivering workshops and lectures around the world and has published numerous books and book chapters and articles on his fields of specialism. Phil, thank you for being here and joining us today and for your contributions to our report as well. You've been part of peace education capacity building and teacher training in the UK and the US and in South America, particularly Bolivia, but also Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia. So drawing from your practical experience from these different contexts, can you tell us more about the importance of teacher training when it comes to peace, to mainstreaming peace education?
Thank you, Caroline. What a great question. And I want to do a bit of a shout out to you, Caroline, and to you, Basma. Congratulations on what is a wonderful report. And thank you so much. I'll ditto what Tony said. Thank you so much for bringing us all together in this a wonderful opportunity to engage together in these questions. And I, like Tony, have many, many questions coming up. So thank you so much. So with regards to the question, if the end goal is mainstreaming peace education, that's to get peace education in classrooms and community, then I think the report does a great job in terms of laying out the importance of teacher training. It highlights questions that teachers need to think about in terms of what should peace education look like in each particular context, what it should be called as well, because in certain places they might not want to use the terminology of peace education, and also some of the issues related to how it should be implemented in the classroom. I think with all those in mind, I want to lay out kind of three things that teachers might want to think about in terms of mainstreaming peace education in formal schools, along the lines of the what, the how, and the why. So when it comes to the what, a question to be thought about is what should be taught. And I think if we look at the literature, there's an argument that could be made that at least 4 core concepts should be taught within peace education classes along the lines of violence, conflict, power, and peace, where I think we know probably a bit more about the first 3 than the last one. I mean, Lederach once said that peace is still a mystery. I think a lot more work needs to be done around what peace looks like in each particular context. And I know some of the panelists here are doing some great work along those lines. But if we think about that in the context of peace education in formal schools, that raises an opportunity and also, let's say, a challenge in the sense that it requires cross-disciplinary work, or as Galton might say, transdisciplinary work. When you think about schools, we have many schools around the world set up in terms of from 9 till 10, you're going to study psychology, from 10 till 11, sociology. So there's one kind of opportunity for us to look at in terms of addressing that. The second one is how peace education is taught. And I think it's widely detailed in the literature that how we teach is just as important as what we teach. So that in itself raises questions around how we go about working with students in the class, or let's say co-learners is a widely used term in the peace education field. That raises questions that it's not just about teaching to. I think one way of thinking about peace education is an orientation towards facilitation for or with, or even further, a way of being with students, a way of being with co-learners. So, and I think you do a great job in terms of the report highlighting this idea of cultivating healthy relationships, which I think is a challenge of how do we go about doing that. I really love, Monisha, who brought up this idea of turning the mirror inwards, which I think is massively, massively important in terms of asking the peace education, asking themselves, how can I go about creating a safe, friendly, warm, authentic, compassionate, caring environment that enables students to address what they want to address in the classroom. So I think that's a really important part to think about how we go about doing that. So I've looked at the what and I've looked at the how, but I think actually much more important than both of these is the question of why. So why is peace education needed? And I think the question of purpose why peace education is needed should come before questions of what should be taught and how it should be taught. And I think along those lines, we can't be all things to all people. We know that peace education is a necessary part, but it's not sufficient. So I think one of the questions we should be asking ourselves is, where should we be focusing our attention in terms of peace education? And I think along those lines, one answer is that in the final analysis, not just peace education, but actually education more broadly, is hopefully about the end goal, producing, let's say, subjects. So people that are capable of not just understanding the world, but changing the world. So that should be kind of an end goal for peace education, and also linked to teacher training. But I think in order to change the world, so Marx was right in one way, we should be interested in changing the world. But I think in order to change the world, we need to understand the world as well. So there's something there about changing the world and understanding the world. So this kind of dichotomy. In terms of those three things that we've looked at and it linked to teacher training, I think three things need to be looked at. One is this idea of what we call a flipped classroom, which we kind of know about. So flipping the classroom in such a way that we look at not just a teacher-led approach, which is kind of predominant in school settings, but more moving towards a student-led, or let's say a world-centered. Gert Biester talks about this approach, which I really like, how we go about putting young people and students or learners in the center, but not at the center. And this will come back to the question of global citizenship shortly. But also I think it needs what they call a flipped curriculum. Broadly speaking, if we look at education, and then it links to peace education as well, we can think of three kind of purposes. One is qualification. So this is about supporting people with the qualifications and skills that they need, let's say, to access the labor market, which is important. And that, of course, we can see that in peace education as well. The other one we can think of as socialization. So this is about understanding the structures that we're part of. And the third one is subjectification, as Gert Biester would call it. So this is about becoming subjects. I think if we look at schooling around the world, it kind of puts a massive emphasis on qualifications, on outputs, on these things, and a less of a focus on subjectification, where I think that peace education could have a really big role in terms of flipping the curriculum and starting with preparing students, co-learners to be subjects. Third thing I want to say, and I want to kind of piggyback on what Kevin said in terms of, you know, the importance of theory, very, 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 very important. The importance of practice. Of course, Kurt Lewin once said, there's nothing quite so practical as a good theory. That's very true. Theory can be thought up of following Foucault and other people as a set of possibilities for thinking, which is very, very important. And at the same time, I want to highlight this importance of judgment as well. In some ways, and I'll put this, you know, up for discussion, in some ways, what we do in the classroom can never be reduced to a theory per se. So I'm very aware that it's always informed by theory, but we always have to make practical judgments in the classroom. In a sense, we have to adopt a fresh way of being with each particular person we're working with or class that they're working with. And I got a quote here from Ernst Christian Trapp, who was actually the first professor of education in 1779, who said that education could never be a science, it's always an art. And I think that in some way is true. So while I agree with the importance of theory, I also want to highlight the importance of this idea of judgment as well in the classroom. So these are a number of things to think about as it relates to teacher training. The second part of the question is the idea of contextualization, and how do we go about the idea of, how does the idea of contextualization reconcile with the idea of global citizenship? And what are some of the dilemmas and challenges that arise here? So when we talk about contextualization, there's consensus in the literature that contexts are different, that people are different. And if that's the case, contextualization means how do we go about adapting peace education to fit different circumstances? So as Basma rightly highlighted it in the report, there's no one size fits all. So this raises questions and opportunities and tensions with regards to tensions between national and global perspectives. I think more broadly, perhaps, it raises the question of what and whose knowledge, resources, and perspectives and practices are needed for building peace. Is it local, subaltern, indigenous, everyday, local perspectives? Or is it outside liberal thematic knowledge driven from outside? What we know from the literature is that there's tended to be an over-focus on outside or over-reliance on top-down, outside imposed ideas of what peace is, and therefore peace education, at the expense of more bottom-up, collaborative approaches to developing peace education. This has been recognized, and there's a whole strand of literature including people in the panel here that have spoke about ideas, you know, many pieces, the local turn, hybridity, friction, decolonization, etc., which are making a great contribution. But it raises the question, is there some knowledge more worthwhile than others? And that's a question to raise that we can perhaps have a discussion about. And I know that Hilary mentioned, and I don't know if she did it in the context of powerful knowledge, but there's arguments on one side of knowledge of the powerful or powerful knowledge, which in a sense makes an argument that actually there is some knowledge that's more powerful than others, and that might be quite controversial. I want to bring this back to the practicality. So I'm right now in Bolivia, hence why a bit of a dodgy connection before, but also experience from being in the UK as well. So two perspectives of how this plays out. Let's take England. This idea of global citizenship, which is a massive strand throughout peace education. How does that reconcile with the UK's approach to British values or fundamental British values? So how do we go about reconciling that and the ideas of citizenship education versus fundamental British values? It's a tension that needs to be worked through. Another one is Bolivia. I spent probably more than 3 years on the ground here working with teachers and teacher training institutes and things like this. Bolivia is often seen as one of many leaders with regards to the decolonization movement, a push away from outside imposed ideas towards their own pedagogical approaches to addressing what they call a politics of change, drawing on their ideas of not peace education per se, but they would call it ideas of vivir bien, living well, etc. How does that also, from being on the ground, reconcile when I'm working with these people that that's also contested? Although it's a big discourse and a massive focus of the current government for the last 14 years, working with people on the ground, they're very interested in listening to ideas from outside as well. So I think in order to close on this one, not just looking at what peace education should look like in each context, and I think this has been brought up by other panelists. I think a main argument I want to finish with here is the process of how we go about deciding what peace education should look like in each context, including listening to, collaborating with those people that are going to be on the receiving end, is just as important as the products that we produce. Unfortunately, that is not always the case in peace education. So I think a lot more work, I would say. I think we could do a better job in terms of working with local communities to look at what should peace education look like in each context. That is not just about epistemological questions of knowledge or methodological questions of how we go about doing it. It raises all questions of human rights, of power, of ethics, and things like this. So I think I want to kind of, and in the end, I think it's a matter of trade-off, how we go about having a trade-off and reconciling these issues with the people who are hopefully intended to be the immediate beneficiaries on the end. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil. Really excellent insights and grounding it in experience as well, and bringing us those great examples of the different tensions that we're dealing with in this field. I'd like to turn now to Maria Nomaku. Maria is the Youth Skills and Inclusive Communities Sector Lead for the British Council for Europe. Maria has an academic and practical background in using theatre and experiential learning methodologies in human rights education, peace education, and intercultural dialogue. As a member of the pool of trainers of the European Youth Forum, she has cooperated with the Council of Europe, the European Commission, the OSCE in Kosovo, and has worked with several ministries of education and numerous NGOs in Greece and throughout Europe. Maria, very warm welcome to you. Based on your experience of teacher training in contexts including Greece and Cyprus, and reflecting on your work with different ministries of education, can you talk to us about what resistance you have faced in mainstreaming peace education approaches in formal schools? Why does that resistance occur in your experience, and how do you think it could be overcome?
Thanks a lot for the opportunity to be part of this panel and this report, and congratulations for your excellent work. I have indeed worked as a facilitator in teacher trainings using different participatory dynamic methodologies such as theatre. And indeed, resistance is one of the challenges I have faced. At the beginning, I was scared, but very, very soon I discovered that this resistance is what makes me feel that what I do makes sense. Why teachers express resistance in peace education? Well, first of all, we have this resistance that you always face whenever you want to bring a change. So teachers, for example, have difficulty in finding time for peace education. Peace education is not part of the national curriculum, and then some schools find it extremely difficult to connect peace education to the rest of the curriculum. They also have the pressure of meeting educational targets, and that really drives them crazy. At the same time, very often we have lack of knowledge and skills relating to the topic. So teachers come back and say, we're never taught how to do that. You expect us to use methodologies we have never used before, to have knowledge on quite difficult topics sometimes. And they feel that since they didn't have the training before, it's very difficult for them to start doing it just because a project started or they received the direction to do that. At the same time, very often they are scared of the reactions from parents. So if parents see it as something which is extracurriculum, very often they are not really happy that their students are engaged in these kind of activities. But this is something you face a lot in trying to introduce new concepts and topics generally. What I found very interesting, especially in this area of work, is the resistance I faced from people, from teachers that have experienced conflict themselves. So you have teachers that their families or themselves experience conflict recently, or they're in countries where there is political instability. They still have a lot of emotions, and then you bring them in a room and you speak about peace education or human rights education, and then some of them really have a very strange, a negative, let's say, reaction. And there you have two categories of people. This is like my experience. The people that express it directly, they say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not happy to do that. I know what conflict means, and I'm not going to speak generally about concepts, etc. I know that I've been oppressed myself, and I have certain messages for my students. And then you also have the people that remain silent. They say what is probably politically correct according to them, but you know that you can't really influence, let's say, their way of thinking, their values even. And then if you ask me about success factors there, the first thing to do is to listen. Well, better say stop and breathe and then listen. I think that's the first word. You need to listen to what these people have to say. All these reactions are real, the emotions are real. And if you don't listen and acknowledge and try to understand, it will be impossible to basically pass any new knowledge or skill or influence values or ways that peace education is done, or if it is done at all, actually, in schools. So it's about creating the safe environment and listen, acknowledge, understand, and then evaluate what you can and what you can't do under the circumstances. So as I always say, don't open the Pandora box. I don't know if you know this myth, if you can't close it, you know. Don't open too many questions if you don't have the time or the skills, because we're not psychologists ourselves, you know. So make sure you evaluate the situation and you know what you can do on the spot and what needs to be done on like long term. It's a process. And we need to remember this. And I always try to remind this to governments or policymakers, organizations, when they build peace education programs with teachers trainings. They often believe that we can have a session or two. No, it's a process, especially when you have to deal with these people that express resistance. It's a process, and you can't have also the expectation that change will come from one day to another. Neither with teachers nor with students. It takes time. Very often you have to shift the attention. Like you shouldn't focus on the local tensions, but actually speak about values, create positive environment, create rules of respect, and basically find ways to solve problems peacefully. And then you will see that actually this change of attitudes can come. But as I said, it's a process and it cannot happen from one day to another. But basically, this is pretty much what we expect teachers to do in classrooms as well, isn't it? To go there and work with their students the same way. And in order to do that, in order to make sure that our teachers have gained these skills to do that the way that it will be successful, we need to invest in trainings for teachers using methodologies, participatory, dynamic methodologies, creating the safe environment, and use them the opportunity also to create communities of practice, express as well their resistance, and help them to find ways to go out of it. Even if it can be resistance, as I said, based on the experiences they have, but also time, tools, methodologies. These are real as well. It's not just complaining. It happens. It's a lot of pressure teachers receive. So as it was mentioned, they need an ocean of support, obviously, and we need to give them this support. So we need to help them practically with these tools, with examples, and basically, at the end of the day, it's not about how you teach peace education only, or how to run a beautiful peace education project in school, but it's how you mainstream it to whatever you do in classroom, from language and history and geography to arts and physical education, how we work together, cooperate in projects with our students, how we respect each other, listen, and respect human rights and different cultures and different people as well. That's all from my side, and I'm really looking forward to read all the questions and listen to the rest of the speakers here.
Thank you so much, Maria. Really, really great to hear your insights, in terms of resistance and how you navigate it, how you're able to bring that into your practice as an educator as well. Thanks so much. Last but by no means least, I'm going to come to Rehan Webb, who is a senior teacher at the British Council, to sort of complete our panel presentations, and then we're going to leave some time to get through some of the great questions that have been submitted by our audience as well. So Rehan, thanks so much for being here and contributing to the report and to the event. For the audience's knowledge, Rehan has worked in teaching English as a foreign language since 1997. And over the years, she has taught at language schools, universities, further education colleges, and teaching centres in Australia, China, France, Germany, Northern Cyprus, and most recently in Sri Lanka. Rehan is also an experienced trainer and mentor and has had various teacher training and professional development positions. Rehan is really interested in the classroom-based research in the form of exploratory practice and in establishing fun and thought-provoking ways to foster adults' democratic and cultural competencies during their continuing and higher education studies. Rehan, my question for you is, as an educator, and as someone who has worked in education systems in many contexts around the world, what do you see as the potential opportunities for really operationalizing some of the ideas that we've heard about today and discussed in the report?
Thank you very much, Caroline. And also thank you so much, Maria. Everything you were saying, I was nodding my head, because so much of what you said is really also my shared experience, especially working as an educator in the classroom with young people and working with teachers as a teacher trainer, and working to a certain extent with senior management of, say, language schools or teaching centres or what have you. So thanks very much, Maria. So I won't go over what you said because you said it so eloquently, and really I hope that resonates with others who are out there in the audience. I suppose just really quickly, what I would like to share with everyone is, as Caroline mentioned, exploratory practice for me has been the way that I've entered into this area of peace education. As I said, I'm an EFL teacher. I've been to many parts of the world teaching wonderful people English as a foreign language. So when you arrive in a country, yes, you can do a bit of homework, and yes, you can find out a few things, but it isn't until you get into the classroom and meet your learners that really you start to realize, oh, this is different here. Things are done differently here. The learners are different. Expectations are different. Everything seems different. So when you get to know your learners over time, especially when I was, for example, in Northern Cyprus, or commonly known as Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, it occurred to me, and it sort of dawned on me, that really over time working with these learners, coming from predominantly Turkish students, Turkish Cypriot students, and some Middle East students in there too, that really there was an undercurrent of things going on in the classroom that I suppose at the beginning I didn't really appreciate or understand. And that sometimes did make learning, even just sort of basic topics of conversation, quite tricky for me as a teacher to get a grip of. So, well, I struggled a lot, and I could see that my learners struggled quite a lot. And I had a similar experience in Sri Lanka as well, which, you know, I think most people know that, you know, it's 10 years now since the civil wars ended, but, you know, it's very raw for a lot of the learners that I meet in the classroom, who are made up of, let's say, you know, Sinhalese and Tamil students, and with two very distinct languages, both official languages of Sri Lanka, but Sinhalese is predominantly the majority. Majority of people speak Sinhalese in Sri Lanka. So again, it's coming in as a teacher, not really knowing what your learners' expectations are of you as a teacher, but also trying to sort of navigate your way through topics of conversation, discussion, and realizing that the competencies that I need as a teacher, and also potentially they would need going through life, are something that we can readily come together on and we can discuss. So the way I got into it really was through the idea of competency-based learning, and asking them, what do you think you're going to need to do this type of thing, discuss this type of, you know, subject or whatever. We talked about media, we talked about, for example, sort of, you know, the hate speech. And through exploratory practice, which is essentially a classroom-based approach to research, it doesn't require any ethics clearance, it doesn't require any funding. It's essentially what teachers do anyway, but they co-construct that with their learners. So it can be done at different age groups. I've seen that other teachers have done it with primary school students in Sri Lanka. So for me, it seems that exploratory practice is a way that you can start working with your learners and co-constructing that kind of knowledge. And you can start to figure out what sort of competencies they believe are going to be important for them. And that can be a bridge towards other types of education, like social justice, democratic competencies, obviously peace education. But for them, it's probably not really a label of education. It's more about how am I going to use these competencies as I go through my life and connect with others, and share all the wonderful things that we can share in this world. So for me, that was my story about how I started to understand my learners a lot better and understand what their perspective on peace education is. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks ever so much, Rihan. Thanks for contributing to the panel discussion and actually segueing us very nicely, I think, to open up to our question and answers. We have had a lot of questions coming in the chat. I'm sure you'll have seen them popping up from time to time. I will do my best to get through as many as possible in the remaining 25 minutes that we have. I will start with a question which is actually for Basma, and it's been submitted by Maksat Bebekov. So this question is, could you tell us a bit more on the pedagogical implications that the report offers? And to what extent do you see these as universal or replicable across contexts? Basma, are you happy to tackle that one for us?
Yes, thank you, Caroline.
Thanks.
I'll also try to speak slower. Apologies for a non-native speaker who thought I was speaking quickly at the beginning. So the pedagogical implications of this report, I think what we're mainly arguing in the report is that we need to move away from feeding students values of peace by rote learning, for example, towards creating a transformative learning experience. And this requires that we ask what pedagogy is most relevant to this particular context. So, for example, critical pedagogies are different from pedagogies of healing or reconciliation. And despite, in peace education and critical peace education, there is always this great value to critical pedagogy, but we need to be aware that sometimes it might cause some unintentional harm in context where, for example, achieving structural change is way beyond the capacity of individuals trapped in conflict or living, for example, under dictatorships where it's really so difficult to achieve structural change. Even if we need, for example, pedagogies of healing or reconciliation in a particular context, we find that approaches that work in some contexts might be fruitless in others. So for instance, sometimes international organizations draw on some developments of pedagogies of healing and reconciliation and emphasize this multi-ethnic reconciliation programs where they directly engage in issues of conflict. But this doesn't necessarily work in every context. I was reading the other day on a cooperative reform project in Bosnian medical schools, where participants argued that such programs that just create a depoliticized spaces are highly more effective in rebuilding broken relationships than formal reconciliation interventions or activities arranged by international donors. And same thing I know and I heard recently from Syrian youth who are creating depoliticized spaces in order to work effectively towards a common goal. And here we need context sensitivity analysis, of course, to the context we're considering what pedagogy that's best there. But again, I hate to get to the conclusion that nothing is universal. And I do believe that some pedagogical aims, for example, that we should be working towards achieving irrespective of context, like for example, working on expanding or widening the cognitive complexity of learners. This is something in order to enable learners to be capable of understanding multiple perspectives or value diversity or pluralism. These are the kind of pedagogical aims that we should work on. And I personally believe that these could be universal across contexts. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks very much, Basma. We've had a cluster of questions around technology. A few people are interested in this element as it pertains to education and specifically peace education. So Ali Spring asks, how do you consider technology's place in peace education and education for peace building, perhaps as an advantageous tool, or does it have harmful implications? Matt Sheeder has also asked, does the shift to online learning, not only that driven by COVID, but also by tech-infatuated policy, pose any particular challenges, opportunities for peace education? Physical isolation doesn't seem promising in this regard. I wonder, does any of our panelists want to offer some reflections on the use of technology in peace education? Hilary, yes, please. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hang on, there we go. On the 22nd of January, which you'll know was a historic day when nuclear weapons became illegal, with my colleagues at the Cambridge Peace Education Research Group, we launched a new initiative. So we've set ourselves the challenge of uploading a daily peace education lesson. And we're currently in the process of trying to get it out to as many teachers and young people as we possibly can from across the globe. And our aim is to start small and organically, but hopefully over time people will be sending us materials. It's around poetry, it's around art, it gives activities for people to engage with, because we want to replace a culture of war with a culture of peace, and to plant the seeds of peace in the hearts and minds of young people, and to do this directly. So we're aware that a lot of young people are out of school at the moment, so we'd very much like them to be engaging in peace education whilst they're home learning or unable to access school more permanently. We're going to be looking at doing this in different languages if we can. We're looking for volunteers to help us. And for a long time, I've resisted online learning because I think peace as a concept is of necessity an embodied process. However, I'm learning a lot through having to do my teaching over Zoom, and the benefits are that you can bring together, as we have done today, people from all over the world to engage in dialogue with each other. People who wouldn't normally be able to attend or participate in events all of a sudden can, because they don't have any travel costs. It's good for the planet. We're not all getting in our cars in order to go and attend events. And you can be incredibly creative. There are new pedagogies developing around online. So I'd really encourage colleagues to engage with these ideas and to think about what could you do if you were going to use online in order to teach peace. So far we've got about a week's worth of lessons that we've uploaded. There's a link in the answers section of this session today. So do go in, click on the link and see, and you'll see there are ideas based on art, on poetry, and on giving young people activities that they can do in their homes and families, without us being able to follow through in any way. We're putting it out, and we're really hoping that young people can engage.
Thanks very much, Hilary. I see Maria would also like to contribute something on this point as well. And Maria, please go ahead.
Yes, I agree with what Hilary said. Really beautiful, let's say, examples out there. Indeed, technology can bring excellent opportunities. Like from our experience at the British Council, we have the Connecting Classrooms project that brings young people from all around the world closer. So there you can learn about another culture. You can really bring these ideas of intercultural learning, intercultural dialogue. And these are fundamental, let's say, principles of peace education. There are also threats, I think, and that's something to consider, because very often when you are hiding yourself behind your screen, you can, you can really hide also parts of your personality, etc. So I really believe that we should be using technology and all the great opportunities that can arise, but at the same time make sure that we don't lose the face-to-face and human contact when we work in these kind of sensitive topics. That's all from my side.
Thanks very much, Maria. The next question here is about the gendered aspects of peace education, opportunities and challenges to advocate for equal rights of girls and boys. And if any of the panelists could outline any particularly useful entry points for development practitioners to integrate peace education as a tool to advance women, peace and security agenda. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to tackle this question or share some thoughts on the gendered dimensions of peace education.
I'd be happy to throw a few thoughts out there.
Thanks, Tony.
I posted in the response in the Q&A a couple of resource links that I think might be helpful, but a good starting point to investigate a good model seeking to implement the global women, peace and security agenda is the localized work of the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. So they've sought, for example, ways to localize and contextualize training, introducing the guiding principles of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 into local contexts. And so I posted a little video in the chat that I think might be helpful for some people. It's a video featuring the director of the program talking a little bit about their approach in more explicit terms that I can give you. But I'd say that's one good starting point. And I also put another resource in the chat that's probably a little bit more applicable to just introducing a gender perspective through peace education. So I put a link for a free download of Betty Reardon's book, Education for a Culture of Peace in a Gender Perspective, that forefronts gender as one of the critical core concerns, if not the most cross-cutting issue of concern within peace education. So I think that's a really useful tool for people looking for some practical examples of how to integrate gender more systemically into peace education.
Thanks very much, and thanks for sharing the tools in the chat as well. That's really useful. I think there's been a lot of posting in there, which I think people can hopefully follow up on after today's event. I have got a question for Kevin here from William Thompson, who asks that you suggest second order can offer change, but change in who and what? What are we changing? How is this captured and realized? And what is the process of engagement? How we actualize this in a school, in an area of social deprivation, where just trying to teach concepts to young learners is very difficult. So this is just really for you to maybe unpack your thinking there for how this can happen in practice.
Yeah, I think it's a good reflective point. And I suppose one of the starting points for me is that I'm a little hesitant with how-tos. So how to do everything, what's the recipe for these sort of practices. But that given, they do need to be practical. And so I appreciate the practicality of it. And so I think what I would start with is some of the practical ways to get into second order reflexivity include things that actually Maria was speaking about. A lot of what I'm discussing philosophically is what Maria has discussed practically. So communities of practice. So educators, teachers who come together after school or before school to discuss their practices and to highlight limits and possibilities within those practices. For teacher training workshops that take place throughout the year, we bring educators together in particular regions to address a topic, maybe online teaching post-corona. I like the post-coronial idea that came out of CPERJ this week, post-coronial thinking. So how do we use technology in order to enhance the way that we'll continue teaching after COVID? Participatory action research. So Phil spoke about Kurt Lewin and Lewin's idea of active research or action research that brings together the practice and the theory in a really practical way, with teachers reflecting on their practices and thinking, what could I do better next time? I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but I think these practical ways, so participatory action research, collective writing projects, collective reflection on our practices, communities of practice, these are all very practical ways that teachers, in many ways, teachers do these things. We practice them very organically, but making it perhaps more systematic, more frequent, and then amplifying the audience that we reach with the message that we have. So I suppose this is the challenge with it, really, is how do we reach a broader audience with the challenges that we're facing as educators, and then get traction with that, so that policymakers and others that are working at other levels are now going to work with us to intervene and to change some of these practices. So I think communities of practice, second order reflexivity, it's very practical, extremely practical. And I think Maria did a very good job earlier of highlighting some of those practicalities of what it would entail.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Kevin. I'm going to try and share with you one more question, if at all possible. Trying to bring them up. Just bear with me one second whilst we nearly made it without a technical hitch, but I think I might have fallen at the final hurdle here. I wonder then, actually, because I know the panelists are very keen to have some discussion with each other, and I have not been able to pull up the list of questions that we had, unfortunately. So is there a burning question in any of your minds that you would like to pose or put out there before we wrap up our session? Hilary, yeah, please go ahead first, and then I think Kevin has one as well.
Okay, could I just say that I've been responding to questions. Hopefully people have seen that in the Q&A. So so there are some responses there. There was one that I thought it would be easier to speak to. Do you mind if I just do that very quickly now? I'll just take a minute and then hand to Kevin. I just wanted to say that this idea of peace education across the curriculum, for those of you that haven't seen some of our work before, it is possible to think of a spiral curriculum. So to think of the areas that you might want to develop, such as cooperation, building young people's self-esteem, their self-confidence, their emotional literacy, their problem-solving skills, and so on, to start at the nursery school with very preschool children and to go right the way through into sixth form, and to think, what do we do in each year in order to build those skills incrementally, and how do we make sure it's a developmental curriculum? We're not just throwing activities that teachers have done and enjoyed, and this actually becomes systematic. So it's possible to think, what do you do in year 1 around listening skills? And then by year 2, how are you going to build on that? A lot of work that can be done in circles. There's work that can be done in maths around kinesthetic learning, around games. Work can be done in PE around competition, in science around how do we collaborate in groups? How do we think about the citizenship and the ethical issues of science together? Obvious links with English and with art and with music. So it is possible for people to come together as a team to think about the core competencies that they're wanting to develop, and to work out where that's going to happen in the curriculum, and to work together to create a curriculum for peace education. So I'd like people to hold on to that possibility. It's something that I've seen happen many times before. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hilary. Kevin, did you want to come in on something there as well?
I was going to make a quick comment, not ask a question, but I just wanted to say that what I'm experiencing here is what I think of as diffraction. And so I think we're diffracting, we're saying a lot of things. So as I was saying a minute ago, Maria is saying more or less the same thing that I'm saying, but from a different perspective, from a different lens. Phil gave a beautiful response to some of the things that I was saying earlier. Same thing, we're saying the same thing, but from different lenses, from different angles. And so I think there's a lot of possibility in just remembering that what part of our challenge is finding out how to articulate ourselves in a way that the audience that we're trying to reach can understand us, can reach us. We're speaking with our audience in the language that makes sense to them. And this is not about talking down to people, but this is about the epistemological divisions that make it difficult for people to understand each other. And so I think, again, Maria is saying more or less the same thing I'm saying, Phil is saying the same thing I'm saying, Tony is, Hilary is, and we have our disagreements, of course, and there are areas that, of contention, but more or less, it's a kaleidoscope, and we just have a slightly different hue to the way that we look at it. And so I just wanted to make that quick comment of how much it means to me, and I think all of us, to be able to hear these perspectives and to see them painted slightly differently. So I really appreciate that. Thank you all.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. I'm just going to ask Basma one question, actually, because I know it's very very much based on what she's interested in terms of her research and so on. And I'd like to ask you, Basma, actually, just to reflect for us on some of the dilemmas, critiques, and ethical concerns raised against peace education programs developed and delivered by international actors, and what you think some of the things the international actors need to do to remain attentive to when operating peace education programs in conflict-affected contexts.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. I think this is a really important question to raise, especially in this space where we might have researchers and practitioners attending with us. And I think to answer this question, we need to talk about calls for decolonizing peace education. And these calls, I understand them as in two parts. The first part is epistemic. In other words, it's like the call to keep the door open for diverse ways of understanding the fundamental nature of peace, conflict, and adversity. So they're a call to address the domination of Northern voices in debates around peace and peace building, and they need to integrate more perspectives of views of local actors. And the second aspect of decolonization calls is primarily political, and it's what we in CPER, Cambridge Peace and Education Research Group, we wrote about. So it's mainly about the ethical duty that we all have to be more critical about politics, power, and privilege. In other words, how we should be reflective on how the research and the reports that we develop and publish, sometimes through frameworks that are devoid of political or historical context, might subconsciously feed into what's called civilizing mission narrative or enhance the stereotypes of the violent other. So, and to avoid this, of course, what we need to ensure is that when we do research, write, or publish reports or articles, is to always try to connect the local to the global, the lives of individuals to their economic, political, and geohistorical context, in order to avoid conveying to the reader or whoever is following our work that the drivers to this conflict are internal to this country or inherent in the personality or the culture of people. So in a way, we might unintentionally pathologize the people that we're working with. And Hilary and Kevin, they use the concept post-structural violence, which is when actors have very good intentions, but they go out to the field and they write and publish reports sometimes, and they achieve adverse results without knowing, or harmful results. So yeah, I think this is, I will stop here because I know time is late, but this is really the importance of politicizing our work and always connecting the local to the global. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Basma. I think that's a really fantastically important contribution, and sincere apologies for having to rush you on the last couple of minutes. These events have, have taken on such energy with people asking lots of questions. So thanks very much for sharing those points with us. I'm very conscious that we couldn't get through the many of the great questions that have been coming in from our audience. But what I would encourage everyone to do is you have the contact details of people on the panel, at their institutions and organizations. I would encourage just to feel free to reach out and ask questions and follow up. There's also, I see lots of great resources and links being posted in the chat. So if you're looking for further opportunities for collaboration and connection, please do check those out. We're posting at the moment a few opportunities, upcoming events, forums, discussion groups, and so on that people can get involved with. So they're being posted in the chat now. So please do feel free to connect via those platforms and join in this discussion beyond today's event. So all that really remains for me to do is to thank you all very much for coming and joining us today. Thank you to our audience for being so active and participatory and asking such fantastic questions. Thanks also to the British Council and the Cambridge Peace and Education Research Group for co-hosting this event with International Alert. And really thank you very much to our excellent panelists for providing such great insights and knowledge, and for joining us today and helping to enrich the report itself. We hope to be able to work with you all much more going forward, and we look forward to continuing the discussion beyond today's event as well. So once again, thank you all very much, and I wish you all excellent days ahead. Thanks very much.